reason the terrorists have been strengthened is because they have a community base. The more Wagner attack those communities, the stronger the terrorists become amongst them. So they're celebrating, but the Russians are also would celebrate because the only place the Nigerian junta can go for help is to Wagner, who will have already said they will rush in with glee, and no doubt the junta will pay Wagner handsomely in gold and oil and uranium for supporting them. But the only people that will benefit are the junta, not the Nigerian people. I think they're facing a real dilemma because both sides have been upping the ante. The junta, as your correspondent said, was signalling very clearly they will not stand down. And ECOWAS has now pinned its flag to the mast that, democratic government must be restored from their point of view, and have threatened military action. If they don't go ahead with the military action, their credibility is weakened, and the risk of further military coups across the region is increased. But if they do go ahead, then it's not clear that they will be welcomed by the people of Niger with open arms, because the military regime have been very effective at redefining this conflict as not one between the army and the democratic government, but between Niger and the imperialist forces of the West, and particularly France, acting through ECOWAS. So they do have some genuine popular support, not universal in the country, but enough perhaps to make it very difficult for an intervention force to achieve its objectives.
Yes, and one wonders what an intervention force would actually do practically. What would they attack? What would the strategy be?
They would have to do what a normal coup plotter does. You seize the airport, you seize the radio station, you seize the parliamentary buildings, and they would then have to bring together the democratic forces within Niger to form a government, but protected by outside soldiers, not by Nigerian soldiers, because it looks like the junta have the largest part of the Nigerian military behind them. Now, either then they've got to get the military to say, okay, it's a fair cop, we'll come back and support a democratic government, or they've got an endless war on their hands where they're fighting the Nigerian army. And that is going to be a very difficult position for ECOWAS to be in. So they're between a rock and a hard place.
Indeed, and the problem is made even more difficult, isn't it, by the fact that several of the member states, including Mali and Burkina Faso, are led by military rulers who prosecuted successful coups themselves in the past few years, and they've said they'll stand by Niger. So what can ECOWAS do if it's not unified?
If you like, ECOWAS is now dividing. West Africa has been polarized between those governments that are ruled by military autocrats and those that have more or less democratic governments. The Democrats have hitherto been in the significant majority across West Africa. ECOWAS reflects their views, and they're very keen not to allow military government to spread, because then they become vulnerable in their countries to military takeovers. And of course, there are outside forces here as well who are maybe keen to encourage this polarization.
Mm-hmm. And we mentioned the Western powers, and I mentioned France specifically. Why do these problems seem to be afflicting the former French colonies at the moment rather than the former English colonies?
France has played a much more active and, if you like, aggressive physical role in their former colonies in the counterterrorism campaign. So whereas in Nigeria, for example, the British military have given support in training the Nigerian military, but only the Nigerian military have been fighting Boko Haram. There are no British troops involved there. Whereas in French Francophone territories, the French military have been very active, as they were in Mali, in leading the counterterrorism campaign. And in the long run, this doesn't appear to have helped them. Although they have successfully kept the terrorists at bay, they have not won the sympathy of the populations they were effectively trying to protect. And France has quite a long history of supporting autocrats who were favourable to them, and unfortunately that reputation lingers on. So
That's right. How
although
much of this did you see, Nick, when you were British ambassador? Well, you were simultaneously to Côte d'Ivoire, to Burkina Faso, Niger, and
yeah,
Togo.
well, there are two different cases. In Niger, I was there during the previous coup in 2010, which actually was, if you like, a good coup, as we've described it, by the military to remove a president who wished to perpetuate his rule. And then they allowed democratic elections. But this coup appears to be the opposite. It's to remove a democratically elected leader and reinstall autocratic government. At the same time, while I was ambassador to Côte d'Ivoire in the same years, there was a democratic election which the president refused to accept, President Laurent Gbagbo, and the French military supported Ivorian forces to ensure that the election was respected. So the French were playing an active role in support of the Democrats in Côte d'Ivoire, and that's the government that is still in power, President Ouattara. So, French role is quite complicated, and over the last decade, they've been trying to play a constructive role supporting democratic governments, but it hasn't helped them in the court of public opinion, partly because, there is quite a lot of propaganda, Russian and other, trying to describe them still as, the former imperialist trying to continue control.
Well, those words fall on very fertile ground for obvious reasons, Nick, both in the Anglophone and the Francophone African world. And we've seen pictures of the young president Ibrahim Traoré, who is a military ruler in Burkina Faso, presenting himself as a modern-day Thomas Sankara, the assassinated leader from 35 or so years ago. What do you think? Well, where do you think this is going to go, I wonder?
The prospects are not looking good. And as I say, this polarization across West Africa looks like it's increasing rather than diminishing. If ECOWAS can effectively and swiftly change the government in Niger back to the democratically elected one, then the tide will turn in their favor. If they're unable to do that, then the tide seems to be running in the direction of increasingly autocratic government across the region. And that would be bad for the West African people, certainly bad for Africa as a whole, and bad for Western interests. The only people who would be celebrating are the terrorists, who do much better when there's a military government in charge. They seize control of more territory.
Despite the presence of Wagner, who say they're helping these military rulers in the likes of Mali and Burkina Faso, and to another extent, Central African Republic.
They're helping them in a particularly brutal way, in that they are attacking all the communities from whom the terrorists come. And that is actually exacerbating the problem, not solving it. So the reason the terrorists have been strengthened is because they have a community base. The more Wagner attack those communities, the stronger the terrorists become amongst them. So they're celebrating, but the Russians are also would celebrate, because the only place the Nigerian junta can go for help is to Wagner, who will have already said they will rush in with glee, and no doubt the junta will pay Wagner handsomely in gold and oil and uranium for supporting them. But the only people that will benefit are the junta, not the Nigerian people.
Nick Westcott, former British ambassador to Niger and now director of the Royal African Society, and indeed a professor at SOAS. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.